A lot of stars burn out. Elvis Presley got turned into a machine, and the machine never stopped. The story people think they know is simple. A poor kid from Tupelo grows up, shocks the world, becomes the king, dies young. But the real story has a crack running straight through it, and it starts the moment fame stops feeling like freedom. Because the most haunting question about Elvis is not how he rose. It's how a singer with that much power could still lose control of his own life in public, on schedule, night after night. Here's the twist that frames everything. Elvis didn't just get famous fast. He got famous in a way that made adults panic. His sound, his movement, the way teenagers screamed, the way newspapers moralized, the way TV tried to contain him. That kind of fame doesn't simply give you opportunities. It also gives you handlers. It gives you rules. It gives you a business built around your body, your face, your voice, your time, and your silence. And once that business is built, it gets very hard to escape, even when the person inside it starts begging for a different life. This episode is a kids versus now timeline with a darker edge. We're following the transformation from the shy, church-singing kid who carried a cheap guitar to school into the man trapped inside an empire of tours, movies, Vegas lights, and prescription bottles. We'll hit the moments the public myth skips, the manager relationship that shaped his choices for decades, the years when the film career numbed his music identity, the 1968 comeback that proved the fire was still there, and the long slide afterward when the world watched the now version of Elvis, struggled to keep up with the legend. Because the most painful thing about Elvis is that the talent never left. What left was the oxygen around it. Elvis Presley was born in 1935, and the early chapters are not glamour. Memphis eventually becomes the backdrop people associate with him. But first, there's the quiet intensity of a small-town childhood and a family that lived close to the edge. Biographies consistently describe him growing up poor, absorbing music from church and radio, and carrying that strange combination of softness and hunger that later made his voice feel both tender and dangerous. The Kids era is full of small details that matter because they explain the man. The most famous one is the guitar. The official timeline from Graceland notes a first guitar purchase in Tupelo and highlights Elvis bringing it into school and playing publicly as a kid, which is exactly the kind of humble, almost ordinary moment that feels impossible once you remember what he became. Then comes the move that changes everything. Graceland's timeline marks the family's move to Memphis in 1948 in search of better economic opportunity. That move is not just geography, it's exposure. Memphis means a collision of sounds. Gospel, blues, country, R&B, and the kind of musical cross-current that later made people argue about Elvis as both a cultural bridge and a cultural flashpoint. By the early 1950s, he's a teenager who doesn't look like the future king, yet in the way people imagine. He's more like an outsider with taste no one can categorize, and that's why the breakthrough feels like a movie scene when it happens. In 1954, producer Sam Phillips at Sun Records responds to Elvis, and the first sessions form with a small band that included Scotty Moore and Bill Black. This is where the before famous part becomes irreversible. That sound didn't just sell records, it triggered a cultural argument. Once Elvis hits, the timeline becomes brutally fast. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, takes over in 1955 and remains in that role until Elvis's death, a relationship that later becomes controversial enough that family members sued Parker for fraud and mismanagement after Elvis died. This matters because it frames the entire middle of Elvis's life. The business decisions, the schedules, the pivots, and the ways Elvis sometimes seemed to be living inside a plan that wasn't fully his. The subject of this video, then, is not just Elvis the artist, it's Elvis the timeline. A boy shaped by poverty and church music becomes a national obsession. That obsession becomes a machine. And the machine creates the most iconic now image while quietly draining the person behind it. The rise is electric because it's built on contradiction. Elvis doesn't arrive as a polished superstar. He arrives like a spark that doesn't know it's dangerous. In the mid-1950s, the records spread, the performances intensify, and the public reaction becomes part of the product. Adults don't just critique the music, they fear the effect. Teenagers don't just like Elvis. They scream like they're witnessing permission to be alive. That tension peaks on television. Elvis's first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 becomes one of those moments that lives forever in clips because it captured the collision between mainstream America and a new kind of youth culture. If you're building kids versus now, this is a clean then marker. The young Elvis becoming a symbol bigger than the songs. Then the timeline pivots again with the draft. Elvis is drafted into the United States Army in 1958 and serves through 1960, including being stationed in West Germany. For some fans, it reads like a forced pause. For others, it's proof he could survive a world that wanted to tame him. The personal life chapter that later becomes controversial starts here too. Britannica's family timeline notes Elvis met Priscilla Presley in 1959 while stationed in West Germany, with an age gap that has been heavily debated ever since. They marry in 1967 and later divorce in 1973. This detail matters not to sensationalize it, but because it shows how Elvis's private life became a permanent public narrative, constantly re-edited by each generation's moral lens. After the Army, the rise continues. But it starts to shift shape. Elvis becomes not only a music phenomenon, but also a film commodity. And this is where the fall begins in a subtle way that fans often struggle to admit. Not a collapse of fame, but a narrowing of creative oxygen. The movies keep him visible. The formula keeps him safe. But the machine begins to decide what kind of Elvis the world is allowed to have. By the mid-1960s, the culture is changing fast. Rock evolves, youth culture sharpens, new stars feel raw, more political, more now. Elvis, meanwhile, is trapped in the perception of being frozen in time, a legend who is still alive but no longer steering the story. And then 1968 happens. The 1968 television special, commonly called the '68 Comeback Special, becomes the moment Elvis re-enters the frame as a live force instead of a museum piece. The special airs on NBC in December 1968 and marks his return to live performance after years dominated by film appearances. Multiple accounts of its production describe how it nearly became a safe Christmas program, but was reshaped into something urgent and physical, including the famous sit-down performances that feel like Elvis proving he still has teeth. If you want one single scene to label the crack, it's not just the slap of scandal or the gossip of private life. It's the look on Elvis's face in that era when he realizes the world is moving and he has to fight his own machine to move with it. The comeback launches a renaissance. It also sets up the tragedy of the now, because after you prove you still have it, the machine demands you use it, constantly. The dark truth of Elvis is not that he lost relevance, it's that he kept winning, and the winning became the trap. After the 1968 comeback, Elvis is back on stage, back in demand, back in the bloodstream of pop culture. The story becomes tours, residencies, TV events, and huge production moments designed to confirm his status as an international phenomenon. One of the most famous is Aloha from Hawaii via satellite, a 1973 concert broadcast via satellite to large audiences across parts of Asia and Oceania, later aired in the U.S. as a television special. Even the legacy section of that broadcast is tangled. It's historic, it's massive, and the exact numbers were debated, which is almost poetic for Elvis, because everything about him gets inflated into myth and then fought over in public. But here's where the emotional peak turns. The same era that looks triumphant from far away is also the era where the now image begins to fracture. Accounts of the mid-1970s describe declining physical and mental health and a dangerous dependence on prescription drugs. This isn't gossip. It's a documented, widely reported part of the Elvis story, and it's the reason the last performances are so hard to watch for fans. The talent is present, the body is struggling, the schedule keeps coming, and it's not just the drugs, it's the structure around him. Britannica notes Colonel Parker remained his manager until the end, and later became controversial enough that Elvis's family members sued him for fraud and mismanagement after Elvis died. Whether you frame Parker as a brilliant promoter, a controlling force, or both, the relationship represents the business side of Elvis, the part that monetizes him even when the person inside the brand is running out of fuel. In 1973, Elvis and Priscilla divorce, another public marker that the private world is shifting. For the Kids versus Now format, this is the emotional hinge. The kid who needed stability becomes the adult whose life is too big to hold steady. Then comes the final year where Now becomes a countdown. History.com's account of his death describes the late-stage pattern: isolation, erratic appearances, dependence on prescription drugs, and the shock of August 16, 1977, when he was found unconscious at Graceland and pronounced dead at the hospital. He was 42. Britannica's summary confirms the date and place, and the age is part of why the story still stings. Elvis didn't fade into quiet old age. He stopped abruptly, mid-legend. The emotional peak is not the death itself. It's the realization that Elvis's final now wasn't a fall from fame. It was fame continuing without mercy. Here's the honest read. Elvis is one of the clearest Kids versus Now arcs because the transformation is visible in every medium: photos, TV, concerts, headlines, and the shifting tone of public reaction. But Elvis also exposes the uncomfortable part of celebrity storytelling. When someone becomes a symbol, people stop asking what the symbol costs. It's easy to build a video that worships him. It's also easy to build a video that reduces him to scandal, decline, or hot takes. The better story is the tension between those two extremes. Elvis can be a revolutionary performer and also a man whose life became dominated by a business structure, relentless expectation, and a dependency that many credible sources describe as catastrophic. So what do you think matters more when we talk about Elvis now? The cultural impact or the cautionary tale? And if the world helped create the machine, does the world share responsibility for how the machine ended? Elvis's now is not just the older face, it's the echo. When people search Elvis as a kid, they want innocence. When they search Elvis now, they want contrast. But the real contrast is something quieter. How a shy boy with a cheap guitar became a global voice, and how that same voice could be swallowed by the very system that amplified it. Some stories were never meant to be known in full. But now, you know where the crack runs.